Off and running. Hello, everyone. I'm Russell Gay, Associate Professor of Management and David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics. Welcome back to the Faculty and Staff Ethics Interview Series. Today's guest is Dr. Dan Bumblauskas. Dan is also an Associate Professor in Management. He's more on the supply chain side, also the Hamilton ESP Fellow for Supply Chain and Logistics Management. Dan's got a wealth of experience in teaching and consulting. An engineering background. He also takes groups to either Ireland or Italy each summer, at least pre-pandemic, every summer. Taught at the University of Missouri before coming to UNI several years back. What is this now? Sixth or seventh?
Eighth, I think. Something.
Time
flies already for all of us.
Right? Yeah, I guess it's 11 for me, so that makes sense that it would be 8 for you. Spent a lot of time in industry before that with companies like Sears and ABB, and Dan's PhD is in industrial engineering from Iowa State. So welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me, Rusty. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about some of the consulting side, some of the practice side, industry side of things for you. So let's talk a little bit about the ethics side of things there that you might have encountered, and just talk a little bit more about your background in those areas first, maybe.
Well, and actually, this comes up a fair amount in my classes, particularly when we get into purchasing and strategic sourcing. But when it comes to the consulting and industry side of ethics, I think one thing that often surprises students as they embark on their careers is how different organizations are and how they handle ethics, all the way from all of the zero tolerance policies with codes of conduct.
Right.
And kind of a lot of them think that everything operates like a big Fortune 500 company. Your John Deere's, Collin Aerospace, ABB, you mentioned my former employer. We had very stringent zero tolerance policies and codes of conduct. When you start to get into medium and small size companies, though, private companies, that doesn't always remain the same. Not to say one is good or bad, but some of the areas get to be a little bit more gray in between as far as what's allowed, what isn't allowed. We get into a lot of interesting legal business law debates about what you can and can't do in operating in various countries, because obviously every country is different in terms of their legal recourse. Absolutely. And how that process works. So I think for students, especially as I bring in some of my experience and say, okay, well, we think this is how it works, but in reality, here's an example of how this worked, or here's an article about something that happened in this country or that country.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting how, different cultures play into this within organizations. And I know one of the things that I often go back to is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, and some of their foreign and anti-corruption practices and guidelines that a lot of organizations use as standards or protocols, because it's one place where holistically you can kind of look at your global operations and say, we're going to try to comply with OECD as best we can. So that's one. I mean, I think that's something that, we bring into the discussions in class, as well as comes up in consulting meetings, and what can and what can't we do based on corporate policies. But I think that students oftentimes think that it's like a one size fits all, like, oh, this is a bribe. Well, is it a bribe? Is it, is it not? What's going on here? What's at play?
That's why I started to chuckle. Yeah, sometimes the students will come to me for HR or ethics advice, and yeah, they always assume that whatever I would tell them I did in this instance and whatever position I was in at the time should apply to whatever company they're talking about. And yeah, you're right. It just doesn't work that way, unfortunately, especially with most of my experience being 15 years ago now, before the academic life. So it's a little outdated now in some ways too.
Well, and I mean, some of those OECD guidelines and trainings have come a long way since you were doing this in your industry experience before coming to academia, and same for me. I've now been out of it from a full-time management capacity for 11 years or something now, but I've kept one foot in the door with consulting relatively, as I kind of look at what companies are doing in this space and some of the different considerations that they have. And I talked a lot in my introductory answer here about international global considerations, but there's also ethical considerations right here at home in terms of how you operate your facilities and what you're doing within them, with it, at a micro level with workers on the floor, and the types of things that are going on there, whether it's preferential treatment, treating people differently in those types of environments. I had a conversation with, I'll call it a small to medium-sized business probably a month ago about this preferential treatment problem being one of their biggest issues. So, and perceptions of preferential treatment. So even if they're not, like, I got a better desk than somebody else. And why did they ethically get that? Is that there's some nepotism at play? Is there some favoritism at play? Like, what's going on that leads to these perceptions and in the culture?
Okay, interesting. I know the pandemic has been hell for the supply chain world, and I'm assuming it's just made ethics that much more of a potential issue too, to try to overcome with all the shortages that the industries are dealing with in your work neck of the world.
Yeah, and I was just one of the panelists for the Jepson Symposium the other, I don't know, last week or whenever that was, where we were talking through some of those types of issues in terms of things from, start to finish in the supply chain and how do we get things through ports. I often tell the story about my own example of trying to ship some materials through a port in Asia where they were held by customs, and sometimes you're not exactly sure how your Asian counterparts get things through that process in terms of being held up with government officials and wherever else. And I often tell a story where I was supposed to go to a different Asian country once, and we weren't allowed to go as American citizens, and there was a bunch of what I'll call questionable practices going on.
Okay.
And the answer that I got was, just let the Germans handle this, because the Germans can handle this. Americans can't.
Okay.
What can the Germans do that I can't do, right? But that's the kind of one of those types of examples too.
Sure.
Where culturally, and as I found out later, in this particular area I was going to, there was like a very high percentage. I've been to a couple of high kidnap locations.
Okay.
Where you get into a situation where I've actually been asked about having kidnap and ransom insurance before, and how that plays in. So you don't want to be going into places like that where you open up a whole nother set of scenarios. And so, yeah, I mean, sometimes it comes down to how that plays out as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's very applicable here. Definitely a different area than I was expecting. How about with some of your student travels? Like I said, Ireland and Italy, most summers, rotating back and forth. What sort of differences do you see when you're traveling internationally with the student groups, maybe as opposed to here that could bring up ethical connotations too?
Well, I think that, you get into this kind of like Western European business environment. You mentioned Ireland and Italy, and those are the two places that I primarily bring students into. I'll take a step back in history to one of my former professors actually at Harvard, who used to talk about taking students to Greece and Italy for study abroads like this when I was, when obviously he was doing this in a position in his career like mine. And he said he used to have all sorts of problems with antitrust understanding and awareness, because you would go into Greece or Italy or one of these countries where the ways deal were made were basically, I'm going to send you and your family on a Mediterranean cruise and take you out to dinner and give you all sorts of both kind of very implicit and explicit bribes, essentially, to make business happen. And there's still, even when I was joining industry, a lot of EU cartels and things that were broken up. You don't realize until you start to talk to professors of mafia history how some of that plays into it in certain parts of Italy.
Okay.
So it's an interesting dynamic. The students, I think they think it's like The Sopranos.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, obviously there's some history behind these mobsters and some of these types of things, but this is still going on, whether it's implicit, explicit, in your face. I still remember being in a country that'll remain unnamed, where some government employees were basically shaking down a business owner for money on the site where my kids were with me. And they're like, what is going on, Dad? Why are they doing this? And I said, this is how this country operates. Like, because they've never seen anything like that in the United States.
Sure.
And so sometimes you take these types of situations for granted, where now I've seen firsthand, like this is like serious business if I don't comply with whatever regulations are put forth by me, either from some kind of organized government agency or non-government agency that exists. And some of those, we'll call them taxes and fees or duties or whatever you want to refer to them as, because if you haven't paid those, someone's going to come calling for them. And that's just a different environment to us. I think one of the stories I tell students a lot is, I think there's an old article that Harvard wrote called "In Russia, Bribes Make the Business World Go Round." So that sort of situation where I think that this is back a number of years, the average Russian company paid about $140,000 in bribes per year. Can you imagine if in our kind of a balance sheet, if we had these kind of numbers? I mean, that just doesn't exist here.
There's a line item that would raise some eyebrows here. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I think when I teach the negotiations class, we do a cross-cultural module in there, and I bring up that some countries bribery is still very much a way of life, and I don't think the students normally believe me. So I'll have to play this part of the video when I teach that next time in negotiation, so they can hear that yes, it's very much still prevalent in some areas.
Yeah, it's definitely an eye-opening experience for everyone, that's for sure.
Yeah. whether the business world, the consulting world, academia, what do you think? Was this notion of business ethics, is it more of an issue today than maybe it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago when we were going through our PhD programs and things? Do you think, as social media just made it seem like it's more of an issue today? Where do you think things stand there?
I think that it definitely exacerbates the situation to have all this communication. I will say one thing that hasn't changed is media reporting and scrutiny of it. So whether it's politicians or business executives,
Sure.
There's always been high profile cases going on. You talk about some of the different countries, and I know one that happened now several years ago, South Korea, and I think the prime minister was embattled with some issues there. You get into all of this, and of course, it's nonstop left, right American politics behind corruption and what's happening. But I think that the media has always, in one shape or form, kind of publicized some of these things, and then it creates a PR problem, whether that's then, it's, I guess, disseminated through Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook or mainstream. I mean, you get into these different communication channels. So I know even back in the day when we would go through kind of corporate ethics training, and you immediately go to Google, right, and you search for your company and see what pops up, and it's just oh man, there's a laundry list of stuff that went on in this country and that country, and you don't want to be in that situation where you're like in a reputation conundrum where it's constantly a bad thing. I think a lot of it goes back to awareness and why there is so much training. I've had countless attorneys that will tell you, first and foremost, never put anything in writing, right? Emails are the worst possible. And well, then you start to say, well, why should I not be able to put it in writing? It's kind of like that. If I'm writing it and I'm sending it, it should be the idea that you should think about anyone on earth reading it.
Right.
And so that's something I think for students is important to realize, that an email, just like a snap or whatever, that can easily get disseminated all over the place. And now you've got an interesting situation on your hand. And I suppose I always used to joke when, Craig, Dr. Van Zandt, our colleague, held the chair, that when you guys, Rusty and Craig, when you guys teach these classes, that I can teach your classes in like 10 minutes. And the only reason I joke about that is because I had mentors that taught me, basic rules of principle and thumb. Like generally, if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right, as an adage I try to live by. And that's something that I always come back to. So if I'm putting it in an email and I'm like, this doesn't seem right, or if I'm talking to someone, it doesn't seem right, now I have to start to say, who's someone I trust that I can go to and kind of bounce this off. I'm like, hey, here's a situation I'm faced with.
Yeah.
And I think students don't realize how quickly they get into management roles where they're tasked with, I've got to make this decision. And it's like really sketch what I should do.
Yeah.
And who do you trust that you could talk to about this decision? And what's the ramification if you make the wrong decision? Is it criminal, civil, legal? Like what happens in these scenarios where now you're maybe in a situation you never expected to be in that quickly?
Right. And even if they don't have the subject matter expert at their fingertips to go to, maybe just let the email sit for an hour and come back and reread it before you hit the send button. Let those emotions kind of settle down a little bit, and just see if you're still comfortable hitting send at that point. But
no, that's good advice. And I would say whether it's you let it sit for hours, days, even a week, potentially, depending on how long someone can wait.
Right.
And maybe write a draft email and run that by that advisor or someone that you trust that could take a look at it and see whether they think it's reasonable or not.
Yeah. I don't always follow my advice there either.
Me either. It's really tough
to instantly regret it, but
yeah, it's really hard sometimes. You talk the talk, but walking the walk and making sure that you comply with your own rules of thumb here, for like this email response example.
I agree. Any other thoughts on the notion of business ethics that you might want to share with the students?
No, I think that back to the supply chain, since I am a supply chain professor, there's a lot of intermediaries and parties involved that muddy the waters, especially in this global trade and finance kind of scope. And that's where you get into this, well, this is just how business is done in country X or country Y. And I think it's important to do your homework and diligence with legal experts. I have a small scale, like legal-ish sort of thing that I'm getting different opinions on. It's kind of like when you go to a doctor for different opinions.
Sure.
So I have one right now that has like almost no bearing of severity whatsoever, other than a couple of small personal things I'm trying to do. But you get one opinion, then you get another opinion, and they contradict. And now what do you do, right? So then it's you continue to pay attorney fees to have them, write opinions or figure out what you should do, and then what's the next step. So you know, with your internal legal counsel and with external, how do you kind of work within those bounds to figure out what's going on in your countries of operation? And you know, you might have a home country like the United States or Switzerland or whatever it may be, and the laws might be pretty well defined there, but then they get to be grayed very quickly as you move into those intermediaries and working with other countries. And
Right.
I don't know how many times in my life I've heard that, Dan, don't worry about it, I'm just going to take care of this in country X because that's how we do
Yeah.
things here. And it's like, well, I feel like I probably need to worry about this a little bit to make sure we're
Yeah.
not doing something that's not compliant with OECD or whatever else, or whatever the threshold for risk for that company is.
Yeah.
Because like, you know, you get into this, I joke a lot in Iowa. We have a lot of companies that start in a garage or shop, then grow into a bigger
Right.
garage or shop, and they just keep growing. And
Yeah.
suddenly, before you know it, you're on a second, third, fourth generation owner, like our colleagues over in business and community service.
Sure.
It's Iowa work with folks.
Yep.
And, you know, for them, they've never had ethics training. They're just rolling, trying to sell stuff, build stuff, make money. And suddenly they're in these situations with suppliers and customers where they're maybe growing to other states and overseas. And they're just like, well, we're just going to do whatever we need to do to make business grow. It's like, I don't know about that. Like, you got to be careful of some of these situations you get into with certain countries.
Yeah.
And how you engage in that and do your due diligence and your homework, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's all great advice. I'm sure the students, our colleagues, community members, whoever might be watching these, I think they can learn a lot from your thoughts on these topics. So, all right. Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate your time. Have a great day.
Likewise. Thank
Thank
you
you very much.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.